John had never imagined that the alien warriors he had once casually exchanged stories with would lead him to inherit a family. And not just any family, but the sisters of his best friend, Crix, a renowned intergalactic soldier from a distant star system. The chaos began the moment the news of Crix's death reached Earth. He was sitting in his small apartment, sipping a beer, staring blankly at the hollow screen. The sudden message from Crix was one he thought was another friendly check-in, but instead, it was a notification from the Vreka Legal Council that would change everything. Before he could process, the hologram of a strange alien woman flickered in front of him. "You are the closest human associate of Crix, and under the sacred laws of the Vreka people, you have been chosen to inherit his legacy and family," the woman's deep, echoing voice announced. John blinked, leaning closer. "Wait, what? I thought I was just a friend." The legal rep's gaze was unblinking. "Your friendship with Crix, although valued, is not the primary matter here. Crix's family, his 3 sisters, are now under your responsibility. You must marry them, as per our laws." John's first reaction was laughter. Surely it was some kind of prank, or maybe a mix-up in the translation matrix. "Marry them?" he repeated, stunned. The hologram nodded. "Yes, it is the Vreka tradition. You, as the closest living human to Crix, are now bound by law to marry his 3 sisters." As the information sank in, John's mind raced. He didn't know the first thing about alien customs, let alone marrying 3 women, let alone alien women. The legal rep's face remained stoic, unaffected by his confusion. "Each of the 3 sisters has their own expectations of you. Your duties will be as both their protector and partner. Failing to honor the law will result in legal consequences on a planetary scale." John shook his head, blinking rapidly. "This can't be real," he muttered under his breath. The hologram flickered for a moment as though sensing his doubt. "It is," she replied. "I am authorized to guide you through the process." Before he could protest, the hologram vanished, replaced by a notification that a transport ship would be arriving soon to take him to the Vreka homeworld. His world seemed to be spinning. The shock didn't wear off in the coming hours, nor did his disbelief, but somehow, he found himself boarding the ship to another galaxy, carrying a legal document that would make him the unwilling husband to 3 women he had never met. Upon arrival, things didn't get easier. A grand palace, too grand, even for the royal family, stood before him. The alien structure, with its towering spires, gleaming metals, and strange lights, was like nothing John had ever seen. His heart pounded as he stood on the threshold of the palace, but there was no turning back. The ship's ramp lowered, and before him stood the 3 sisters, each more intimidating than the last. Zura, the eldest, was tall, regal, and radiated an aura of authority that made John feel tiny. She studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing in a way that felt like a challenge. "So you're the one who inherited my brother's legacy?" Her voice was like the sound of metal scraping against stone, sharp and unyielding. Veka, the middle sister, stood slightly behind Zura, her posture more casual but no less commanding. She had a techie aura about her, with gadgets dangling from her belt, and a piercing gaze that seemed to assess John with clinical precision. "You don't look like much. Crix was always a bit bigger, you know," she quipped, her lips curling into a smirk. Then there was Rika, the youngest. Her eyes gleamed with an innocence that didn't quite match the situation. She had a mischievous smile, as if she knew exactly what she was getting into. "Well, if you're the one we have to marry, guess we'll see how long you last." The playful taunt was followed by a wink that left John unsure of how to react. John stood frozen in place. Marrying these women wasn't just a legal obligation, it was a nightmare. He had no clue about alien cultures, their customs, or how to keep up with them, let alone how to be a decent partner. The laughter and sarcastic remarks of the sisters made him even more aware of his lack of understanding. Zura, the serious one, led the way as they entered the palace, and John followed them inside, wondering what absurd task he'd be expected to perform next. Dinner that evening was an experience unlike anything John had imagined. The table was laid out with strange foods, some of which smelled absolutely awful. John stared at the dishes, unsure of how to even begin. Vecca, with her techno-savvy nature, quickly took the lead in explaining the process of eating like a wrecker. But John had no idea how to approach the situation. She handed him a device that she explained was a spoon, but it looked more like a futuristic fork with 10 prongs. She then encouraged him to use his hands, leaving him confused and awkward. "Oh, don't worry," she said with a grin. "Your earth hands won't offend us. Just try not to spill anything." Zura, ever the authoritarian, was silent, watching John closely, her eyes never leaving him. It felt like she was scrutinizing every move he made, waiting for him to fail. And of course he did. His first attempt at lifting the strange food to his mouth ended in disaster, spilling it all over his lap. The sisters laughed, loudly, and John, utterly embarrassed, tried to play it off with a nervous smile. But the more he tried to understand their customs, the more he realized just how out of his depth he was. But there was something about Zura's steady gaze that kept him grounded, something in her stoic demeanor that somehow promised that, despite the awkwardness, everything would somehow be okay. Vecca, on the other hand, saw his discomfort as an opportunity to mess with him. "Don't worry, Earthling," she teased. "We won't judge you for your primitive ways. Much." Rika's playful nature continued to shine through. She leaned in close to him and whispered, "I bet you can't handle all of us, can you?" Her voice was teasing, but John wasn't sure whether to laugh or start running for the hills. This was no ordinary family inheritance. This was a mess, and somehow, he was right in the middle of it. By the end of the night, John was left standing in his room, staring at the ceiling. He had expected his earthly life to go in a certain direction, simple, boring, with a few laughs here and there. Now, he was entangled in an alien political drama and a forced marriage to 3 incredibly different sisters. Was this what being an heir really meant? Because if it was, John wasn't sure how much more he could take. The next morning promised more challenges, more misunderstandings, and somehow, more of the sisters' relentless humor. He wasn't just in for the ride of his life, he was in for the absurd, the awkward, and the unexpected. And as much as he wished he could back out, part of him knew that there was no turning back now. This wasn't a marriage, this was an intergalactic comedy, and he was the star. The next day, John found himself sitting in a grand hall, surrounded by the 3 sisters who seemed to have made it their mission to test every boundary of his patience, sanity, and self-restraint. The air was thick with tension, and the sisters wasted no time in making their opinions clear. They had already decided they weren't just going to let this whole marriage thing go smoothly. John was now stuck between their demanding personalities, each one so different from the next, and the awkwardness of the situation weighed heavily on him. Zura, the eldest, was all business. She sat across from him, scrutinizing his every move as if she were preparing him for some sort of intergalactic trial. "So, Earthling," she began, her voice cutting through the air like a blade, "are you prepared for the responsibilities that come with being our husband?" The word hung in the air, sharp and uncomfortable, and John shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Look, he started, but she cut him off. "You think this is a joke? That it's just some alien tradition you can laugh off? You are bound by law to us now. We will see if you can handle it." Her cold gaze pierced him, and for a moment, John wondered whether he'd ever be able to live up to her expectations. Vecca, the middle sister, was a completely different breed of alien. She lounged casually in her chair, her arms draped across the back like she was bored out of her mind. "Oh, lighten up, Zura. The guy just got here, cut him some slack. He's probably still adjusting to our customs." Her smile was wide and mischievous, and John could tell that she was more interested in pushing his buttons than actually following any kind of decorum. "Besides," she said with a chuckle, "I'm sure he'll figure out how to keep us happy eventually. All men do, right?" The way she said it made John feel like he was already failing in some way he couldn't even fathom. But Rika, the youngest, was the wild card. She had this playful, flirtatious edge to her that made John's head spin. She leaned forward, her lips curling into a grin that made him question whether he was in over his head. "Don't listen to them," she said sweetly. "They're just trying to intimidate you. We all know you'll come around eventually." She looked him up and down, clearly enjoying his discomfort. "I'm sure we'll find ways to get along," she added with a wink. John didn't know how to respond. Was she being serious? Was this all just part of the game they were playing? The constant tension between them had him questioning what the hell was going on. But as much as John wanted to get out of this mess, he knew he couldn't. Not now. Not with the situation so entangled. The sisters, despite their very different personalities, were still a package deal. And somehow, he had inherited them. What had started as an unexpected responsibility had now turned into something far more complicated, and far more absurd. The sisters made it clear that he wasn't just expected to follow some vague marriage guidelines. They had their own rules, their own customs, and it was John's job to figure it all out. Unfortunately for him, they weren't interested in making it easy. Every conversation seemed to end with a joke at his expense, a challenge to his masculinity, or a sarcastic remark. And as much as he tried to get a handle on things, the more he realized how out of his depth he truly was. "Tell me, Earthling," Zura demanded one evening as they sat around yet another strange dinner table. "How do you plan on managing our differences?" Her tone was heavy with challenge, and the weight of her words pressed down on John's shoulders like a physical burden. He glanced nervously at the other sisters, who were each giving him their own version of the "get it together" stare. Vecca smirked, clearly amused by his discomfort. "What she means, Johnny boy," Vecca teased, "is how do you plan on keeping all of us happy?" The way she said his name made John cringe, and he struggled to find the right words. I don't know," he stammered, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't sign up for this. I didn't ask for any of this, but—" He paused, trying to gather his thoughts. "I'll do my best. I just need time to understand things. Your culture. The way things work here." "Time?" Rika raised an eyebrow. "Oh, honey, you're gonna need more than time. You'll need patience, tact, and a good sense of humor to survive this." She flashed a teasing grin, as if the whole situation were nothing more than a fun game. But something in her eyes told John that she wasn't entirely kidding. The playful banter masked an undercurrent of something else, a deeper sense of expectation. "All right, Earthling," Zura said, her voice still stern, but there was a hint of something else underneath it. Was it approval? "We'll give you a week. A week to prove you can handle this. If you don't, well, let's just say it won't end well for you." The words hung in the air, heavy and threatening. John's mind raced. A week? To somehow prove he could live up to their expectations? To learn an entire alien culture, and somehow win over 3 women who barely knew him? He had no idea how he was going to pull this off, but the stakes were high, and there was no way he could back out now. "Don't worry, Johnny," Vecca teased again, a smirk playing at her lips. "You'll figure it out. You're a fast learner. I mean, you've already learned how to eat like us, right?" She nodded to the strange food on the table, making John cringe again. He didn't even know if he was doing it right. Rika giggled, clearly enjoying his discomfort. "And don't forget, we've got a lot of time on our hands. Plenty of time to see what you're really made of." John rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the situation press in on him from all sides. The playful teasing, the constant challenges, the unspoken expectations, all of it was becoming a whirlwind he wasn't sure he could control. But somehow he had to. He had no choice. If there was one thing he was starting to realize, it was that surviving this, whatever it was, would require more than just patience. It would require a level of self-awareness he hadn't even known he needed. John had to navigate the delicate dance between humor and authority, between being an outsider in their culture and somehow becoming part of their world. As much as he hated it, he had no choice but to play their game. There was no turning back. This was his reality now. And as much as he tried to resist, part of him couldn't help but wonder, maybe, just maybe, he might start to enjoy it. The following days were a blur of awkward conversations, uncomfortable silences, and moments that made John question everything he thought he knew about relationships and culture. The sisters, each with their own quirks, agendas, and moods, had made it clear that they weren't going to make things easy on him. But as much as he tried to resist their constant push for him to adapt, it was becoming more and more evident that he wasn't just being tested. He was being pulled into something far deeper and more complicated than he could have ever anticipated. It started with the simplest of tasks, learning their traditions. Simple in theory, not so much in practice. Zura, ever the serious one, took it upon herself to teach him about the formalities of their society. This meant John spent hours listening to her lecture him on everything from the importance of body language to the proper way to address the royal family. It was both mentally taxing and, quite frankly, hilarious to watch him stumble through every lesson. You can't just walk into a room and expect to be treated as an equal, Earthling, Zura lectured one afternoon, her brow furrowed as she paced in front of him. You'll need to show respect, and not just with words. She folded her arms, giving him the look of a disappointed teacher. Do you know what that means? John swallowed, glancing down at his clothes. I'm guessing my t-shirt isn't gonna cut it, huh? He muttered, more to himself than to her. Zura didn't even crack a smile. Exactly, she replied sternly. Your attire is an indication of your status. You wear that like a human soldier, not a husband. You are expected to present yourself as a dignified individual when you interact with our people. John felt his frustration building. This was becoming absurd. His whole life had been thrown upside down, and now he had to learn an entire culture in a matter of days, while also trying to avoid the chaos of living with 3 alien women who expected him to be their husband. He glanced over at Vecca, who had been sitting in the corner, watching him with a mischievous grin. Don't look at me like that, John groaned. I don't even know what the hell I'm supposed to be doing here. One minute I'm just a guy with a weird alien friend, and the next I'm being lectured on marriage by his sister. And don't even get me started on the whole wife thing. Vecca raised an eyebrow, her grin widening. Oh, Johnny boy, it's only going to get more interesting from here. She strolled over and casually threw an arm around his shoulder, completely ignoring his discomfort. You're the one who's got the title now. You think you can just walk away from all this without some consequences? Consequences? John repeated, his tone filled with sarcasm. You mean like the endless expectations and constant emotional blackmail type of consequences? Exactly, she said, her eyes sparkling with amusement. You've inherited a whole new family, buddy. It's not just the sisters who have a say in this. There are entire political ramifications, too. Trust me, you're about to learn just how deep this goes. John's head was spinning. How had he gone from just trying to help his alien friend to suddenly being dragged into a political power struggle with royal family implications? And on top of all that, he had to deal with the fact that he was now supposed to be married to these women. But it wasn't just the serious stuff that was getting to him. It was the bizarre, absurd moments that seemed to happen whenever he was around Rika, the youngest sister. She had this way of completely turning any normal situation into something completely ridiculous, yet oddly endearing. Hey, Johnny, she purred one night as they sat around the dinner table. Do you think our people have the same needs as Earthlings? She said it so casually, as though they were discussing the weather. John blinked in disbelief. What needs? You know, she said, leaning in closer. The kind of needs you and I both know about. Her voice was playful, almost teasing. Don't tell me Earthlings don't have the same passions as we do. I'm sure you've got some thoughts on that, huh? John felt his face flush with a mixture of confusion and embarrassment. I'm not sure what you're asking me, he stammered, feeling completely out of his depth. Oh, come on, she purred. Don't act like you haven't noticed how beautiful we are. Surely you've thought about it at least once. John opened his mouth to protest, but Rika wasn't finished. She leaned in further, her face inches from his, and in a voice that dripped with innuendo, she whispered, You'll figure it out eventually. Her words left him speechless, and he couldn't even begin to comprehend what was happening. Was she actually hitting on him? Was this part of some weird cultural norm that he was supposed to accept? He had no idea. But then Vecca jumped in, clearly sensing his discomfort. "Don't let Rika get to you," she said with a wink. "She's just trying to make things more entertaining." "Entertaining?" John repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You think this is entertaining?" Vecca shrugged, her playful smile never wavering. "Hey, life's never boring when you're married to us." John couldn't help but laugh. As much as the whole thing was insane, there was something oddly charming about their dynamic. He had no idea what was going on half the time, but in a strange way, he was starting to get used to the chaos. Meanwhile, Zura remained the ever-watchful, disapproving figure in the background. "Enough games," she said one evening, her tone sharp. "This is not some kind of game. We have a duty, and you have a responsibility. Our culture, our laws, they demand respect. And you, Earthling, need to step up. If you think this will just be some series of amusing incidents, you're wrong." John straightened up, realizing just how serious she was. "I know. I get it," he said, trying to reassure her. "I'm trying. But you've got to give me a break. I'm learning. This is all a lot to take in." Zura's eyes softened for a fraction of a second, before her usual steely gaze returned. "You have a week. After that, if you haven't proven yourself, well, let's just say there will be consequences." The words echoed in John's mind as he left the room. Every day seemed to bring new challenges, new complications, and new layers to this bizarre situation he had found himself in. He wasn't just navigating strange customs and complex relationships. He was learning what it meant to be tied to this family, this culture. And the weight of those expectations was becoming harder to bear. But one thing was clear: no matter how ridiculous or overwhelming it got, John was in this for the long haul. And somehow, he was starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to care for these sisters. Even if he didn't know exactly what that meant yet. The tension in the air grew thicker as the days passed. John was beginning to understand the true weight of his position, though the confusion and absurdity were never far behind. The sisters, despite their individual personalities and quirks, had all made it clear in their own ways that they weren't exactly thrilled about the situation either. They might have been the ones to initiate the marriage law, but they weren't exactly keen on it either. However, despite their resistance, a strange bond was slowly starting to form between them and John. He could feel it in the subtle glances, the small gestures, and the rare moments of tenderness that crept into their interactions. One evening, after a particularly long and exhausting meeting with the Royal Council of the alien planet, John found himself alone with Vecca. She was leaning against the doorway, an unreadable expression on her face. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said with a smirk. John didn't bother with the usual sarcasm. He was too tired, too worn out. "I think I'm going crazy," he admitted. "I don't know how to handle this. It's like every day brings a new problem I didn't even know existed." Vecca's gaze softened for a moment, and for the briefest of seconds, John saw a glimpse of something more human in her eyes, something that wasn't just a product of their strange circumstances. She walked over and stood beside him, looking out into the distant horizon. "You're not the only one struggling, you know," she said quietly. "We didn't exactly ask for this either. It's not easy, being thrust into a situation like this, having to share our lives with someone who doesn't even understand the basics of our culture." John turned to look at her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. "Then why do it?" he asked. "Why follow this law if it's causing so much pain for everyone involved?" Vecca didn't immediately answer. Instead, she folded her arms and looked down at her feet, clearly wrestling with her thoughts. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and measured. "Because we don't have a choice," she said. "This is the way it's been for centuries. This is our way of ensuring that our family's legacy is carried on. The marriage law isn't just about us, it's about preserving something much bigger than any of us. It's about duty." John let out a sigh, rubbing his temples. "That's a lot of pressure to put on someone, though." Vecca chuckled darkly. Tell me about it. I think you're starting to understand just how much we've all had to carry. John didn't know what to say. He had only just begun to scratch the surface of the complexities of their culture and the intricacies of the relationships he was now a part of. But as much as he wanted to throw his hands up in frustration and walk away, he couldn't deny that something had shifted between them all. It was like there was an unspoken understanding growing, a fragile bond that was slowly forming despite the chaos and misunderstandings. As the days wore on, John found himself becoming more and more entangled in the web of family politics and traditions. The royal family of the alien planet had its own set of rules and customs, and those rules were not always kind to outsiders. John learned the hard way that every interaction with the royal court was a delicate dance, where one misstep could have disastrous consequences. One particularly tense meeting with the king left John feeling utterly defeated. The king, a towering figure of alien authority, had been cold and dismissive of him from the very beginning. The king had made it clear that he didn't see John as a true member of their society, no matter how much he had been forced into this marriage by the ancient law. It was clear that John would have to earn his place, and fast, or risk being rejected by the royal family entirely. But the most uncomfortable part of it all came when John was forced to sit through an elaborate ceremonial dinner, a custom that involved the sisters formally presenting him as their husband to the rest of the royal court. It was meant to signify the start of a new chapter in their lives, but to John, it felt more like a circus act. The eyes of the entire court were upon him, their stares heavy with judgment and expectation. Zura, ever the traditionalist, made sure to remind him of every single protocol, each more absurd than the last. Remember, she whispered in his ear before the dinner began. You must bow low when the queen enters. She is our matriarch and must be respected at all costs. If you make even the smallest mistake, you will lose favor with the court. John nodded mutely, his stomach twisting with anxiety. He had barely kept his composure through the royal council meeting, and now he had to deal with this? It felt like an endless gauntlet of alien customs and expectations. When the queen finally entered, the room fell silent. She was a regal figure, with an air of authority that seemed to pulse through the room. John had seen Zura's strictness, but the queen was on a whole different level. As she walked past him, John did his best to follow Zura's instructions, bowing low and keeping his head down. But as he stood back up, he caught a glimpse of the queen's eyes, an icy blue that seemed to see right through him. For a moment, he wondered if she knew just how out of place he felt. After the dinner, John was left alone to stew over the events. He had managed to survive the formalities, but it was clear that his position in this family was tenuous at best. Every time he thought he had a handle on things, something new came up that threatened to throw him off balance. The next day, as he sat in the courtyard, trying to gather his thoughts, Rika approached him. She sat beside him, her expression unreadable. You know, she said, her voice soft, this isn't going to be easy. But I think you're starting to get it. John raised an eyebrow. Get what? The whole thing, she replied. The law, the politics, the culture, you're starting to understand the weight of it all. She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. But more importantly, I think you're starting to understand us. You might not like it, but you're part of this family now. John looked at her, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. I don't know if I'm cut out for this. Rika smiled, the hint of mischief back in her eyes. Don't worry, Johnny boy. You'll figure it out. And in that moment, John realized that maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to understand exactly what Rika meant. He had been thrust into a situation that was far beyond anything he had ever imagined. But despite the absurdity, the tension, and the difficulty of it all, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of belonging. In a bizarre and twisted way, this family had started to feel like his family, too. He just hoped he could hold it together long enough to figure out how to make it work.